Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. I would like to begin this conversation with Dr. Bukhari. Dr. Bukhari, you have heard about the Disinfo Labs revolution and the report that they have formed. How fragile India's situation is right now after this report came in front of all of us.
That the information operation that they've been running for, they say about 15 years, going back to 2005, I think that's been exposed, and obviously they won't be able to benefit from that. But I don't think that I would term India's position as fragile. And quite frankly, things like these are to be expected. Perhaps the only surprising element is the length. The time length at which this was run, the resources that were put in. We're talking about a web of entities that were engaged in perception shaping, you can call it psychological operations, but essentially information warfare, and to basically shape a particular narrative about Pakistan, building on sort of the post 9/11 situation in Pakistan. Especially as you got to the middle of the 2000s decade, and then sort of building upon that. And mind you, this is the same time frame that we're talking about, during which Pakistan went through a lot of crises. So from a tradecraft point of view, I think this was a sophisticated display of tradecraft and skill set. And so I think that this is something that still needs to be unpacked. And we need to be prepared for it. Look, the United States government has an entire entity based in the State Department called the Global Engagement Center, GEC, which is designed to counter information operations from actors like Russia, China, Iran, ISIS, and others. So I think that countries like Pakistan and others will be jumping into this game as well. There's already talk of fifth generation warfare in Pakistan, although I would say that the way it's discussed in Pakistan is a bit misguided, and the efforts need to be redirected at understanding how information warfare is coming from peer actors.
Right. So, Dr. Bukhari, if we take it this way, then don't you think so that there should not be any hesitation from Indian side, in owning this network and saying, yes, we're doing this. If you can do it yourself. I mean, they could have come up with this blame game. They've rejected this. I've spoken to their spokesperson of their ruling party, BJP spokesperson, and their official statement also came. So don't you think they should have, owned this and said, yes, we've done this?
No, why should they? I mean, does anybody own anything? When the Russians were caught interfering in the 2016 U.S. elections, what was the response? Vehement denial. And this is to be expected. You don't own it because there's a lot more damage from that. There's nothing to be gained from it. And so I don't see why they should have owned it. And of course, they're going to learn lessons. So they've had a 15-year run uninterrupted, and they were able to build a narrative. Now that's been exposed. They're going to go back to the drawing board, and they're going to perfect their tradecraft. They're going to come up with other ways in terms of to shape perceptions, global perceptions, through the media. I mean, India isn't the only country doing this. Every actor in the world is doing this, especially countries that are. I mean, the surprising element of this is you don't expect the country that's a democracy to be engaged in this kind of stuff, but you do expect it from actors like China, autocratic regimes, because they're built on information warfare, which is targeting not just the world at large, but also their domestic population.
Right. Let me just take this conversation to Kugelman. Mr. Kugelman, there's a lot of debate going on about this, right? And all of this debate is about how credible is this Info Lab, and then there is also a debate about how credible is BBC and all that from the Indian side especially. So regardless of the fact how mammoth or how minor these organizations are, how is country in a situation who gets caught red-handed and the news is out there, they're rejecting this, right? But the blame is on them.
understate the significance of this report. I mean, the scale is quite notable. I mean, as Kamran had said, this is something that we're told goes back 15 years, which is quite long for a single disinformation program. And also the fact that you had a number of entities that were involved that are household names in the international media sphere. I mean, certainly one could joke about the likes of the Tuscaloosa Times and the Buffalo Breeze and some of these fake news outlets that many would take to not be true. But we're told that, ANI, which is one of the major Indian news outlets, had been posting a lot of the content here. And ANI has had relationships with the likes of Yahoo News as well as the Reuters news service. So clearly that's going to be very familiar to a lot of people. But I think that the question of the disinfo lab and its credibility, I would argue that it actually works to the benefit of Pakistan, because I know that Pakistan has always been unhappy with the fact that its government and others in Pakistan have been claiming that India has been doing disinformation campaigns, but that not a lot of people are going to believe that because it's just Pakistan's government that's saying this, and that could be taken by an audience as propaganda in of itself. But now you have this independent group, the EU Disinfo Lab, which certainly is not a household name in the grand scheme of things, but it is, as I understand it, an independent NGO. I think that brings a credibility. In terms of India's response, I agree with Kamran. We wouldn't expect India, and particularly the current government, to admit to something like this. What would it get out of that?
Right. So, Mr. Kugelman, there's another phenomenon, about lots of involvement by the international stakeholders in any country. And if we talk about Pakistan and India, and there's a lot of debate going on, there's a lot of problems going on between these two countries since long. There has been lots of wars and problems. So what do you think, what role international powers are playing in this India-Pakistan phenomenon, and what benefit they would have out of this all?
Well, I mean, certainly I think that the international community, particularly those that follow India and Pakistan closely, are concerned about the tensions between the two countries that are particularly strong now. I mean, clearly this is a relationship that has its better moments and its very bad moments, but now, really over the last few years, it's been particularly bad. And clearly there's a recognition that the revelation of this Indian disinformation campaign will cause tensions to deepen even more. But I would not overstate the attention that the world on the whole is paying to these revelations. I mean, to be quite candid, yes, there had been some international media coverage of this disinfo lab report. The BBC, of course, came out with a big report, but here in the U.S., it really hasn't gotten that much attention. I mean, there's just attention on other things, and that's actually very similar to the reaction after Pakistan came out with its dossier describing Indian or state-sponsored terrorism. So I think that that's a challenge for Pakistan. I know that for Islamabad, there's a very fervent desire to try to figure out ways to get key capitals, certainly Washington, but others, particularly in Europe, to pay more attention to the troubling things that India is doing and to pressure India to move away from that. And of course, we know that the geopolitics of the day suggested that's relatively unlikely, just because of the strategic importance that so much of the West, and not just the West, but the world on the whole, accords to India. So it's going to be very difficult, I think, for Pakistan, at least in the near term, to try to get its position, its view of these concerning revelations from India, to get that at the top of global agendas. And of course, there's just a lot going on right now. But I go back to what I said before. The messenger here is very important. This is not a case of Pakistan, the Pakistani government claiming that India is doing this huge 15-year-long disinformation campaign. It is an independent European NGO, and I think that's significant in of itself.
So this is exactly what Pakistan is trying to do. I mean, if there's something going on against your country, I think this is any country's right, don't you think so? Just to tell the rest of the world that whatever is happening wrong. And then, like you said, there's a third body there who's reporting on something, and then there's BBC who is endorsing that thing. You don't think so that this is the right of any country doing this, or you disagree with this?
No, of course. I mean, it's obviously it's Pakistan's right, and it's any country's right. One would expect a country to react in the way that Pakistan has to what happened here. But let's be quite clear. I mean, if this disinformation campaign with all these hundreds of fake news outlets and 15 years of disinformation, if this had been something that had been perpetrated by Russians or Chinese, the global reaction would be a lot different. I mean, I'll be very frank with you about that. I think that's quite clear. And if this had been something that Pakistan had done, the global reaction would have been a lot stronger as well. I mean, this is just sort of a reality, I think, that Pakistan has to deal with as it tries to figure out how to get the world to pay attention to these types of things. Coming out of a country like India, which is a country that certainly, key capitals, analysts, academics, or others are certainly willing to criticize, particularly as we've seen over the last few years, very troubling indications of democratic backsliding in India, as this Hindu nationalist government really takes increasingly maximalist positions across the board. But it's completely different to expect that there could be some type of global campaign trying to push back on India and what it's been doing. And also, to go back to what I said before, this report alleging or coming out with this information about disinformation campaigns in India, it did not explicitly, actually, it didn't take a position at all about the Indian government's role. And I think that's important. I mean, it didn't say that the Indian government was not involved, but it distanced itself from taking that position. I think if there was more clear, explicit evidence that Indian governments over the last 15 years had played a role in this, perhaps that would lead to a bit more of a concerted reaction from the world. But to answer your question, absolutely. Pakistan has every right to try to publicize what happened. It's only natural.
Right. Ambassador Durrani, let me ask you this question. Indian government is not behind this, and there's no mention of the Indian government. Do you think, is this even possible, doing this, running this network in a country without the support or role of any government, Ambassador Durrani?
I think it goes without saying, because if you look at the Srivastava Group's modus operandi, and they were running the show for the past 15 years, so there's a need to look into the financial position of that group which was running this show. And then similarly, they have been taking the MEPs from the European Parliament to India and to occupied Kashmir and Bangladesh and Maldives. So I think there is a need to probe into that. And then certainly the MEPs who in fact issued statements against Pakistan, or for that matter on human rights, they have to look back, and then they have to see whether they were taken for a ride by the Indian media. And of course, behind that, it was India. So in that respect, and then more importantly, India is also involved with regard to the registration of NGOs with the ECOSOC. So, and then they have been, in fact, wrongly, there are over 10 NGOs which have been registered with the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. So their delisting is due, and I think the Indian government would try to block it in tooth and nail. So in that respect, I think India's involvement and its government's involvement is very much there. Otherwise, how can this totally unknown group can run such a big show? Yes. Right.
Dr. Bukhari, let me ask you this question. In the report, there's a mention of about more than 10 NGOs like Ambassador Durrani has just mentioned, and 750 plus fake media outlets, 550 plus domains, this whole entire network. The question does not revolve around Pakistan. There's UN, there's European Union, which have been through this all. They've been cheated as well. This is also part of the report. So asking a question based on United Nations and European Union side, I mean, the bluff is not there with Pakistan or the Pakistanis. The bluff is with UN and EU as well. How concerning this should be for these two bodies?
Well, look, I mean, no country, no alliance, if you will, we're talking about the EU, would like to be able to tolerate being misled, be the target of disinformation, even if the information does not pertain to the target audience. It pertains to a third country, in this case, Pakistan. So this is very worrisome. So Obviously, neither the United Nations nor the EU or the United States, the international community in general, would not want this to be happening with impunity. So that's one thing. But here's the problem with when we say how can this be dealt with? And I think that's where sort of we're entering the weak link in this chain. There's nobody there to actually enforce this. Now, the EU could open up an investigation if it chooses to, and there could be mechanisms by which you get into cybersecurity issues, you investigate these organizations, and then it depends on legislation. The EU is not a government. The EU is an alliance. It's made up of
the Parliament has initiated an inquiry on this.
Of course, but the problem is one of having teeth. Right. And here the EU has no teeth. The EU is weakening as an entity because its entire structure is based on the fact that all member states need to say yes for something to happen. And none of the member states have surrendered a bit of their sovereignty to Brussels. So Brussels cannot act unless the principles act. The analogy is with the United Nations Security Council. Unless there is consensus among the great powers, the 5 permanent members and then the 10 rotating non-permanent members, you don't get a whole lot done. And so to expect that there'll be something done, I think that's just a bit too much. Obviously, there'll be investigations. The Pakistanis would like to see this investigation. They'd like to be able to sort of use that to strengthen their position. But at the end of the day, Murtaza, the bottom line is we live in an age of information operations. This is going to get worse as technology becomes more sophisticated, as tradecraft becomes more sophisticated. I see intelligence agencies of major countries expending a lot of resources on info ops. And I think that, we're looking at it's kind of the analogy with the arms race. One country buys weapons, the other country goes out shopping as well in order to balance the terms of engagement. I think we're going to see something similar here. I think everybody's going to indulge, invest, and expend resources to gain the capability to counteract these things.
Right. Michael, there's an understanding that U.S. is there, let me just not say support, but, is there, have a little inclined towards India, right? Now, for instance, if we consider that this is a fact, and this is a known fact that U.S. has lots of stake in India, and that's why they're supporting them. And India, on the other hand, is, working aggressively and massively to destabilize Pakistan. On the other hand, U.S. has lots of interest in Pakistan as well. There are lots of stakes, American stake here in Pakistan as well. What U.S. is actually doing? I'm confused. They have stakes in India. They're at their back. They have stakes in Pakistan. So where it is heading towards?
Yeah, well, I think that for U.S. policy, the key interest is for the India-Pakistan relationship not to deteriorate and get out of control so that you have to worry about a crisis and especially a conflict. As you alluded to, indeed, the U.S. I think has cast its strategic lot, so to speak, with India in South Asia. I think that's quite clear, and there's bipartisan support for that position here in Washington. But in terms of its reaction to the revelations about this campaign, again, it's going to be something that those officials that follow India and Pakistan work on. Of course, as you know, we're in a transition period here, where the Trump administration is finishing up, and the Biden administration is preparing to take over. So we're still in a position where those officials that are going to be focusing on India and Pakistan in the White House and State Department and elsewhere, in many cases, these people are not in place yet. That's going to take some more time, which is another reason why we shouldn't expect the U.S. to be seized of this matter in a big way. And something else to keep in mind here is that this is something that does not directly impact the United States. This is a disinformation campaign that exploited the EU and the UN. This is not something that impacted the U.S. or the U.S. government. And I certainly think that the EU and the UN come out of this looking pretty bad. And I think that's sort of, in terms of their own self-interest to try to move forward and investigate what happened, that there would be a very compelling need for that, just because clearly they were exploited and taken advantage of by these disinformation specialists. But, this was not something that targeted, so far as I know, did not target U.S. officials. It did not target the U.S. government, at least not directly. So I think that's something else that would lead the United States government, which is dealing with so much right now, particularly multiple crises at home, that now is not the time to expect it to be taking any type of major stand. I mean, we'll see what happens once the Biden administration takes office and has settled in. I imagine that there'll be diplomacy and requests from Pakistan for the U.S. to be looking at this in combination with other things, such as the dossier that the Pakistani government came out with about India. But now is just not that time, I think, for the reasons that I mentioned.
Right. Mr. Bukhari, last question to you, sir. There's an understanding that India being so aggressive and, the aggression we've seen in Kashmir especially, this has, this shows that India is in no mood, to sit and talk on any issue related to Pakistan. You talk about CPAC, you talk about any other development projects there's going on, anything related to Pakistan. India overall has a strong narrative, strong stance, and there's oppression and aggression, I would repeat, in Kashmir going on since long, and especially after this 5th August. Don't you think so that this approach, this specific Modi approach, is isolating India from the rest of the world, and this eventually will hit back India at some point?
Yes, I mean, as Michael pointed out earlier, that has been an uptick in criticism at the backslide of democracy in India and what the right-wing Hindu nationalist government of Prime Minister Narendra Modi is doing, not just in Kashmir, but all over India. But let's put all of this in a wider, broader geopolitical context. The United States is ramping up efforts to counter China. This is something that the Trump administration was doing, and the Biden administration is expected to further advance U.S. efforts on all fronts. India is needed as a major ally in that effort, and therefore things like these get ignored. I mean, this is the reality of geopolitics and foreign policy making, is that you have to make choices. If you're Washington, are you disturbed? Are you worried about the future of India and what's happening? Yes, of course. But that's not something that Washington can shape in one form or another in a direct way, in a significant way. India will have to evolve out of this situation where you have a government that's very assertive and is trying to change the political culture at home and has led to rising tensions in the region. Now, of course, the United States will step in if this gets out of bound, but that prerogative of the United States has to be balanced with the American need for allies against China. So I think the Indians are looking at this and saying they have nothing to lose, especially with the Chinese pressing hard in Kashmir, on the line of actual control in Ladakh. And so there are plenty of reasons for the United States to give India a pass on this, or at least ignore it for a while, maybe issue some form of low-level note saying, this is not good, but then move on. This is just the reality of things. I think that from a Pakistani point of view, again, I don't encourage, if you will, any type of, race geopolitical that can lead to escalations. But my forecast is that the Pakistanis will have to up their game in terms of counter-info ops. The United States is doing it. Everybody's doing it. So I think that the ball is in the Pakistani court, not the American.
Right. Last question to you, Ambassador Durrani. So, what is your forecast about the efforts Pakistan is doing? I mean, there's dossier, and then there's a recent report, and then there's a lot of other things going on. Is our diplomatic front going into the right direction, or we need to change this, or this will go like this?
I think it's a difficult task, but at the same time, Pakistan is doing its bit, and I think Pakistan has succeeded. You may not have results immediately, but finally it is. For instance, since last year when India put a lockdown on occupied Kashmir, so for the first time the international media picked it up, and India was quite embarrassed. Then subsequently these dossiers, if you look at them, and then now I think there are some incontrovertible evidence which is there, and it is going to embarrass India. And now these Indian chronicles by EU private agency, they have come up. So yes, Disinfo Lab. So that is also, in fact, will be a source of embarrassment for India. It is, for that matter, it's just not India. It could be embarrassing for any country, whether small or big. So the question, when you talk about in diplomatic terms, then I think India won't have the face. And then, say at the UN General Assembly or at the UN Security Council, they want to plead for human rights, and they want to claim to be a democratic state. And the way they have been behaving in this manner, I think we are still living in a civilized world.
Right.
Maybe there is a real politics, maybe perhaps, but at the same time, I think that real politics, when you look at it, so United States finally had to negotiate with the Taliban. There's no match between the United States and the Taliban.
Right, thank you so much. We had former Ambassador Asif Durrani. We had Michael Kugelman, who is the Deputy Director of Asia Program, South Asia. We also had Dr. Kamran Bukhari, who is the Director of Analytical Development at the Center of Global Policy, Washington, D.C. Thank you so much.